I feel like I can't remember the distance that I sit away from the camera. Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kayla and I like to talk about books, mostly book reviews. Today I'm going to be talking about the book Counterfeit by Kirstin Chen. So this book was a little bit of a surprise for me. Since it's a pretty new release, I'm gonna try and have like a spoiler-free kind of synopsis, not exactly like a full summary, and then I'm gonna go into the review. If I do talk about something spoiler related, I will give a big warning, but that won't be until like the very end. So Counterfeit by Kirstin Chen follows a lawyer who lives in San Francisco, a 37-year-old woman named Ava Wong, and she is married to a surgeon who works at Stanford, and basically she's kind of at this weird transitional point in her life where she's been staying home with her little toddler for an indefinite period of time, hasn't gone back to work yet, kind of wants to do something, but of course she also realized that she just really didn't like her job as a corporate lawyer. It just was not something that brought her joy necessarily, and not every job has to bring you intense joy, but she's feeling a little bit aimless. It seems like she also doesn't really enjoy being a parent that much, so she's in this kind of weird transitional period, and she actually runs into or meets up with her old roommate from college, and this is where really everything in the story starts. She sees her old roommate who used to be super dorky and kind of a little bit more quiet, and she sees her and she's completely different. She's carrying a Birkin bag and she looks just crazy different. She's definitely had eyelid surgery. And so this roommate's name is Winnie, and she talks about how she's running a handbag business, and she travels back and forth between China and San Francisco all the time regarding her handbag business. But it sort of comes out as they kind of get to talking and getting to become a little bit closer again that Winnie's handbag business is actually a counterfeit handbag business, and it's actually a pretty ingenious scheme, a pretty ingenious idea, where she has contacts for incredibly high quality counterfeits, and she buys bags from department stores, from fancy boutiques. She'll go into a Chanel store and buy a Chanel bag and then return a counterfeit Chanel, take the real Chanel and sell it online for profit. So it's a highly profitable business, and she's expanded it so much that now she has a bunch of buyers beneath her who essentially do what she started off doing, buying up all of these bags, returning the counterfeit handbags, and then selling the real ones online. So basically she gets Ava to start helping her out with her business for kind of a couple of reasons. A, because Ava's at kind of this weird transitional point in her life. B, because she obviously has knowledge of the law. And C, because she has a US passport. Ava has been born and raised in the US, and she has a US passport, and she's one of those people who's very unsuspecting. She's a Stanford grad. She's just not somebody that you would suspect of anything shady, versus obviously I think there's a huge bias against Chinese immigrants and Chinese people in general. There's been this long-standing racist narrative of Chinese people being untrustworthy, obviously dating all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of the late 19th century. So this is really deep-rooted in US culture actually, and I feel we don't talk about it a lot, which is crazy because it's a huge problem. But anyway, so she starts helping her out with this, and basically the whole story is kind of from the point of view of Ava Wong telling it to a detective. So you know this pretty early on. She keeps saying detective. So you know that she's relaying this information to a detective, but you don't fully know the circumstances of how it unraveled, what happened, and it's primarily from Ava's point of view until later on where we do get a little bit from Winnie's point of view. So kind of interesting. Like I said, I don't want to give away any spoilers, so I'm going to leave the synopsis there, but it definitely builds and gets really interesting. This book was way better than I expected, to be totally honest, and a very interesting peek into the world of counterfeit handbags. Like, wow. I'm gonna leave that there and just move right into the review because I feel like I actually have a lot of thoughts on this book, good and bad, but mostly I really enjoyed it. So I'll start off by saying I thought this was a good book. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. I thought the story was captivating and super unique. Like I said, that insight into kind of like the world of counterfeit handbags, that whole world was just so different and so unique and such an interesting way to tell a story like this. It just made me want to keep reading. So I feel like primarily that's like one of the things about a book is if you just want to really keep reading it and you don't want to put it down, that's usually a sign that it's a pretty good reader. At the very least, it's very captivating. So that was something that I just really enjoyed. I just was like, the story and the characters as well were very interesting. There were, however, some formatting things that were a little bit strange to me, like how basically the dialogue was never really quoted. It wasn't like traditional dialogue, and so it wasn't like quoted as dialogue. I believe this was a stylistic choice because most of the story was like Ava relaying her story to the detective, but it was a little bit odd because there were also like very intense like detailed descriptions, so it was just a little bit odd. But I understand that it was because she was maybe like paraphrasing to the detective, but you basically hardly ever saw, I don't even know if we ever really saw any quoted dialogue. It was just like, oh, he said something like this, and like it was just a little bit odd to me. Like I said, I understand, I think the choice and the reason behind doing this stylistically, but it was still kind of difficult to get used to, and by the time I got used to it, I was basically done with the book, so it was a little bit odd. However, the story itself, so captivating, and the characters were really fascinating reads as well. I loved the relationship between Winnie and Ava and how it was not how it initially seemed. There was a lot of like peeling back layers of an onion there, and I really enjoyed that. I also really liked that both of their characters were very dimensional and contained like a lot of gray area. They were very gray characters. They were doing some things that were unethical, but it was definitely like you're not really looking at them as just straight villains, so it's really interesting. They had a lot of gray area, and I always like that in characters. I don't necessarily always want a character that's just 100% good, 100% bad. That's not really how people are. Something else that added a lot of depth to not just the characters, but the story in general was the deconstruction of the model minority idea that uses Asian Americans to further racist ideology, but also the ways in which the biases were openly acknowledged in the story. I thought that that was really interesting because it's not just picking apart the idea of like the model minority, but just the open acknowledgement of biases in the story was just really interesting. There was one point where they were having lunch at Neiman Marcus, and a woman made like a racist remark to them, being, you know, Asian women. She said referred to them as Oriental, and it was really interesting how, first off, how the two characters took it differently, but also it was just really interesting how kind of like fact of life and matter of fact they took that as, especially Winnie. It was just really interesting and an insight into something that I don't personally have to experience in my day-to-day, week-to-week life. That's not something I have to experience, and it's kind of a good reminder that obviously that's a benefit, a privilege in my life. So another really good example, and the one that I actually like put in my notes, was the admissions SAT cheating scandal that involved many students from China, and this was kind of like why they think Winnie left Stanford, and how compared to the cheating scandal that was involving like wealthy white US students pretty recently, that the rhetoric was like a lot less sympathetic and a lot harsher, and they were judged a lot more harshly for this, and basically there was like no wiggle room. All of these students were expelled, and everybody just thought that they were terrible, even though some of them, again, were very privileged children coming from China. But because they were from China, there's, like I said, there's this long-standing idea of like the untrustworthy Chinese, and exactly going all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which literally codified it in law. So, I mean, I don't know how much clearer you can get that this is a really messed up part of US culture and our past and our present. This is just one example, or two examples, I guess, like the woman at Neiman Marcus, but there were a lot of times that these themes were displayed and woven throughout the story. And honestly, the whole business itself sort of depended on and exploited the idea of the model minority, because they largely depended on the fact that Ava was not somebody that anybody would suspect, and they used a lot of like younger, like college-aged women who were considered to be like wealthy, like immigrant students, wealthy exchange students, to do these types of things because nobody would really suspect. And it was kind of also interesting too, because Ava specifically, when she made some of her returns, would choose a white woman in the boutique because of this bias. And it was really, really, really interesting, all the little ways in which this was just woven into the story. And I absolutely loved it. I also like live in the Bay Area and loved that it took place in San Francisco. And it was just really a very, very thoughtful read. I thought this book would be good and fun and interesting, but I did not think that it would be a book that would get my brain churning so much. So that was definitely a surprise in a good way. This would be an amazing book club book. This would be a great pick to pick apart with friends, family, and just kind of talk about some of the themes that you notice, some of the character developments, and things like that. So I loved it. I actually think it's an onion of a book. There's a lot to peel apart, a lot of layers. Okay, this is kind of a spoiler alert, so I'm gonna give a little bit of a spoiler. She goes to Hong Kong to visit her family, and at one point, her husband is like upset that she kind of last minute goes to Hong Kong to visit her family and removes her access to their credit cards. And it's played off as like he's not that bad, but I'm sorry, that is so messed up. She was in Hong Kong with their 2-year-old son and he did that. And the explanation was sort of like, oh, but she was with her family. There's no way she would have actually needed it. She had everything she needed. But I'm like, no, if you're traveling internationally with a 2-year-old, you need to have access to funding in case there's an emergency. Like, that was mind-boggling to me that he could do that. That's really not okay. Just because he's like mad at her that he would do something like that could potentially have very negative consequences on their son. That was like so messed up to me. So I won't get into like that much more, but it was interesting. It was interesting, some of those little components. But because of the way the story's structured and because it's all like Ava's point of view, it's a very like one-sided telling, and you don't realize that until you get to Winnie's part. So like I said, I don't want to give a lot away, but I'm already in like the spoiler section. When you get to Winnie's part, you realize that Ava's side of the story is the side that she's telling the detective, not necessarily how she actually experienced it. That's all I'll say. I think that's all of the really, really interesting stuff I wanted to talk about with this book. I could probably talk about it a lot more, to be honest, but I think I'm getting into like the rambling zone. So I'm gonna leave this review here. Please let me know below if you've read this book or if you're interested in reading it, like what your thoughts are. I would actually really, really like to know. This was a very interesting read for me, and it was kind of a surprise interesting read. So 4 stars maybe? I would give it 5 for thoughtfulness and story originality and all of that, but like I said, the formatting thing kind of makes me want to take a star off because it did kind of like annoy me when I read it, but I understand why it happened. And yeah, that's gonna be all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, please subscribe, all that stuff, and I will see you later.